Hello and welcome to the second video in creating a 3DO file for Dark Forces. So the first video is the one of everything that you will need to make a 3D model, assign textures to it, and get it running in the engine. This second video, and you should obviously watch the first one because that will cover the basics, is on more advanced techniques used for taking the details and lighting of a different object or different effects within the scene and having that baked down into a single texture for then bringing over into use in the game. This is a more modern 3D workflow. It's quite common for a high-res mesh or a different mesh or a mesh with a huge amount of detail on it in general to be made, and then a lower, far more suitable for a game engine mesh to be made, and then the details are transferred through a process called baking, which sort of ray tracing comes in on the object and basically transfers the details from one to the other. That's what this video is going to cover, as I find it is a very, very useful technique for a range of purposes, even for a game as old as Dark Forces. It can just give you a great starting point of a texture. Sometimes that'll work as is, and sometimes you'll need to use it as a base and then paint on it further to get the sort of desired finished effect. But at any rate, it's far more effective, at least to my mind, as an artist, to start with something like this and then paint on it further, rather than just starting with literally blank white 256 pixels squared or whatever you're working with. So let's get stuck into it. As you can tell immediately, this file is far more complicated than the one we were working with previously. We've got this shader editor up here, which is all node-based. I find that to be super useful, but of course, if you've just installed Blender 20 minutes ago, something like this might rapidly do your head in. So again, this is just one of the different options that we've got here, in the same way that a 3D viewport is an option. The UV editor or image viewer down here is an option. Space to, search for something like a hue saturation value node, which does sort of exactly what it sounds. If you want to plug something into it on the side, make it far more saturated, and then plug that color value back in, it would flow through the nodes, generally from left to right, until it hits a material output node, and then away we go. What we're going to use this for, and I'll provide this file so you don't need to worry about setting it up yourself, is if we just hide our low res table for a second, turn on viewport shading, and again, this is using ray tracing. So if it's set to Eevee by default, you'll want to go to this little render properties, which is the camera icon, select cycles instead of Eevee. If your GPU is supported, select that there. If your GPU is not showing up and it's just showing CPU, even though you have a fancy card, edit preferences, system, and then under cycles render devices, CUDA if you've got it, or if you're an AMD person or someone with different type of card, different type of setup, laptop, whatever, your device may or may not be supported for cycles with one of these other driver options here. But I have an NVIDIA card, it's selected. I haven't selected the CPU as well, because if I'm recording a video and using the GPU and using the full CPU, things are just going to crash. It'll go way faster and bake the texture even quicker, but need some of those system resources to make this video work. So that is where you would change that. So as we can see in the viewport, we have some lights, which I will just select with the left mouse button there. Middle mouse pan, which isn't sort of showing up on the viewport display there for whatever reason. Mouse wheel zoom, middle mouse pan, and our object already has some detail to it. If we scroll all the way out, we can see that there are some lights above as well. This is just to give us a bit of variation on the material, which again, like you can sort of see where I've got the 1, 2, 3 lights up the top. When we look from the top down, these being rectangular area lights, they're sort of casting a little bit of rectangular light on them. Again, this sort of a setup should work for a wide variety of objects that we've got in the middle here. And if we were to just roughly follow along what's going on in the materials, again, you can just use these as is. The main part of what you're going to need to know is this here. If I make it blue, that'll make the material blue. But what I am actually going to do right now is delete that high-res table, show you just the low-res mesh, select that mesh, delete that, and if anything goes bright pink like that in Blender, it means there is no texture found, because we are going to create a new one and go through this process from scratch. So if I create a new texture, the default is 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels. Nothing inherently wrong with that, but for the scope of Dark Forces in general, that's actually very high. So with the Force engine specifically, we can definitely at least have a 256 by a 256, or 128, depending on how big your object is. That is going to do for us. We are going to call this table 02, because I've already made table 01, so that's just going to give us something different to work with. New image, and it'll at least give us a black flat image. Now, because we're going to want this image to be the name of our material when it's loaded into Dark Forces, we are also going to make sure that is called table 02 there. Now, this has got the previously baked image. If we use the drop-down menu, set it to table 02. Okay, so we have our low-res mesh. If we just go back out of material view, go into our edit mode here, not an overly detailed mesh. There's a little bit more cleanup we could do with some of these vertices, but for now that is going to do us. What we are going to do though is Shift D to duplicate the mesh, right click to cancel the move. So now we have table and table.001. Now, using these icons here, this is hide in the viewport or hide in the rendering. We're going to hide our low-res table and select this one. I'm going to rename that table_high, just because we're going to add more detail to this mesh and then transfer that from one to the other. So on our high-res mesh, this is where we want to assign those materials. So I'm going to remove that, add a new material slot, which you can also add another one here. And instead of clicking new material, we're going to select brown, which we changed to blue a second ago. We're going to select gray. Now, when this gray one shows up, it is immediately putting some darkness in the corners. That is due to us using some ambient occlusion, which is a common sort of 3D technique to basically just darken surface shadows where two faces are sort of close to each other or sitting on each other. There is some other stuff going on. You see we've got a little bit of a bevel effect. It's very small at the moment. If I change that up to 0.2, it softens the shading a bit. This sometimes works better than others, so what we're going to do, as well as just leaving that where it was, is get back out of the shading mode, and we're going to apply a modifier. So modifiers, this blue spanner here, add, select generate, and then go down to bevel. So that, again, quite subtle because the scale is quite small. The other thing is that under geometry, there is a clamp overlap. So if I was to uncheck that, what it does is it's not afraid to let faces that get too close to each other go through one another. And that can sort of cause some of these weird issues down here. So clamp overlap you generally want on, but what we can do in edit mode, because we're going to show some of this troubleshooting stuff, these vertices don't really need to be here. So shift select those, merge at last. Again, it's good to show some of this troubleshooting stuff, and not hide that I was a bit lazy putting that in there, but just to also show if this issue comes up, this is how you fix it. And you can see that this side is already way cleaner than the other one, which we will just fix as well. Now, before I forget, I'll just tab back into object mode, hide that, bring up our low res table because this is going to need fixing here as well. Almost there, folks. Where this can also be an issue is if you had modeled these two layers of table separately and there was two vertices sitting right on top of each other. You know, sometimes that can cause issues, sometimes you get away with it. But we have now fixed our low res table. Bring up our high res table again with the bevel, which we can now push further than we sort of did before. But I think still halving that back to 0.05, that looks about right. So being a modifier, we can dynamically change this as much as we want, go into edit mode, and the structure of the mesh is still the same, which is sort of the whole point of doing it as a modifier instead of just adding a bevel to a particular edge in edit mode and doing it that way. We can also change the segments. And again, this model itself, the high-res one, is not going into Dark Forces at all. It's purely to get the texture effect. So if this ends up really, really high poly, just for the sake of getting the lighting and stuff to look right, at that point, that's fine, because we're only ever going to put the low-res mesh back into the game. So we've got our model. It's currently got 2 material slots, but only 1 material assigned to it. So what I'm going to do is if I select this edge here, Control R or Command R on a Mac will give you the option to cut an edge loop. And if you click once, it'll then let you slide it along. And if you left click a second time, it'll let you confirm that. The other really handy thing about Blender's edge loop cutting tool is again, select that edge, Control R, and then use the mouse wheel. You can just put in as many extra loops as you want. This is a very, very efficient way of modeling, and this kind of thing is particularly why a lot of long-time Blender users will favor the keyboard shortcuts over the gizmos, because once you start combining a lot of those keyboard shortcuts, it just makes things way, way faster. So we're going to add 2 loops like that, and it'll select, you know, keep selected whatever you did last, basically. So if I grab these loops for the G key, move them down a little in the Z-axis, that already gives us a bit more depth to our table, because the lighting is behaving as if there is, well, because there is, a change in shape along those faces. Yeah, so again, just getting ourselves a bit more detail that will look nice and uniform on the table in texture form, without having to sort of paint in lights and shadows and bevels and things like that ourselves later. I just find that quicker. But there's ways of doing bevel and things in Photoshop or any other texture painting program as well. It's just that this will oftentimes be more visually accurate for what you're going for, I guess, and is a very handy starting point to paint over, which is kind of the whole point of this second video. So if we again go back into edit mode, face select. Now, if I was to hit E to extrude and bring that up, and then S to scale, you'll see that it is uniformly scaling these, but the boundary around that part of the table sort of doesn't behave as you might expect. So this is where, just to undo a couple of things, the inset tool comes in. So I for inset, and then that will bring that in uniformly from the edges surrounding it. So, you know, you can imagine already what that sort of thing is useful for. If you've got girders and you wanted to cut uniform holes in the girders, or just, you know, any sort of shape that looks like it was mechanically done on purpose. You know, some organic uses for that as well, but yeah, these edges will now be of a uniform length. And so it gives that look as, you know, it was designed to be this way on purpose, which is what we're going for. So if we were to E extrude in the middle here, I to inset, E to extrude to just bring that down a bit. And now we can put some brown. I will just change that color back to basically what it was. And start assigning that color highlight to some of these faces. So if I select one face, select that material, select assign, it'll do what you think it does. If I Alt left click on an edge, perpendicular to that edge, it'll do its best to select a loop of faces. So again, just to show that, if I Alt select there, and then you can keep going by doing Shift, Alt select, and again, this is where your sort of cutting nice clean loops into the mesh comes into play. We can select these, assign to be brown, tab into edit mode for a second, and so we've now already got a bunch more detail on our table than we had previously. Just a few more things we can sort of do in this realm. If we hit Control, or Command on a Mac, and plus, this will grow the selection outwards. If we hit Control minus, this will shrink the selection inwards. So now we can make that entire center bit brown, and maybe we want a bit of a glow. So we will do Add Material Spot, New Material, Emission, set the strength to, I don't know, 8 thereabouts. Alt click on that edge to select that loop, assign, and now we have a two-tone table with some lights on it. Because this light is shooting directly upwards, it's sort of hard to see that effect on other faces. But if we were to select under the table and make that glow, we would then see that the emissive strength of this material is affecting anything else around it. So it's basically like putting an active light on your object that is illuminating everything around it. This would be incredibly expensive to do in a game engine, and of course it's something Dark Forces doesn't support at all. But that's kind of why we're doing this texture baking method, is because you can make use of anything that Blender's renderer can do, bake it into a JPEG or a PNG, which we then convert into a texture file that can be used in Dark Forces, and we get that effect for free. It's just all part of the texture instead of actually happening in real time. So again, that value was more like 6, and away we go. So now that we've got our high-res table and our low-res table, I'll just turn off the high-res one for now, open up the low-res. We covered UV mapping in our previous tutorial, so this is something I've already done here. If you are doing texture baking, you need to make sure that each individual part of the mesh has its own part of the texture. If you have two faces overlapping, one will bake the part of its texture that it's supposed to have, and then the other one will just bake straight over the top of it, and it'll look like a glitch, because that's going to have two different parts of the table stretched over areas they're not supposed to be. The other thing you'll notice is because I had this UV mapped earlier, and we adjusted merging those vertices, this now no longer aligns. However, what you can do is basically the same thing in the UV unwrap. So, merge by distance, that's not going to work there, but I can control snap it to where it was. Merge by distance. If we just sort of bump this up to 0.1, just to make sure that's going to work. So G for grab, move it close, merge by distance. And again, leaving this in on purpose, so you can see that if something like this does go wrong, anytime you change your structure of your mesh, so the amount of vertices, have you added in any extra edge loops, it's best to go check your UV map, because the UV map doesn't dynamically update with the mesh itself. So there will probably be some gaps or some issues that arise. I'll just whip through the rest of these because you've seen the process, and there's only one more to go down in the corner here. Okay, UV map all looking good. Nothing is overlapping. There are gaps between all the parts of the layout. One more thing to check, which I did not cover in the previous video, but it's a troubleshooting thing. The normals of the faces. This is literally the same as the little line that you get in the Dark Forces editor showing you which direction the wall is facing. There are two ways to check this. So if I go into edit mode, if this toolbar gets too long, you can middle mouse scroll to bring that back over, and we can turn on face orientation. So blue is facing the viewer or the camera. Red means it's the other side of it. So if we were to zoom inside of our table here, we can see that this is red. What will happen in most 3D engines is they just either won't display this face at all, or it'll show as flipped and, you know, just look like the entire thing is inverted in the middle of space, which we don't want. So short version, blue good, red bad, and you can toggle that on as an overlay in the viewport, or you can toggle it on per face. So this is far more subtle when you're working on a 3D mesh. It'll just give you a little perpendicular blue line to show this is facing outwards, and then nothing to show you it's not facing this direction, it's facing this one. So, you know, while you're working on a mesh, you can just leave that on, keep going. It'll add normals in if you add any faces, which we didn't actually want to do. But yeah, it's just something that you definitely need to keep in mind, because when it works great, you don't notice. When it breaks, you will notice immediately, regardless of what piece of software or, you know, operation you're sort of trying to do. So we'll just make sure that one's turned off, that one's turned off. Select our whole mesh, and on the low res mesh, this is where we want to keep our one material named Table02, our one texture called Table02, because texture baking won't work unless there's an actual texture assigned to that object to bake to, which makes sense. But again, if you've not used Blender before and it gives you an error saying no active image, you'll be like, what has no active image got to do with, you know, baking this ray tracing down? So at this point, we've got our low res mesh, we've got our high res mesh. I'm going to turn them back on. They are overlapping, and the structure of this high res one, that's probably a bit too far away. It will probably still work, but what we're going to do is just bring this back down a little bit height wise. Shift select these inside faces. Again, Control plus. S for scale, Z for the Z axis, G for grab, Z for the Z axis, and just bring that in a little closer to the table. And we've got one edge loop up the top here, which we probably don't need at all. Something like that. So we're still getting the detail, but there's not that much, there's less of a discrepancy between the shape of the two meshes. If one is protruding through the other to some extent, that's fine. I'm going to cover the setting to make sure that that works within the bake. So select the high res table, select the low res table. At the moment, this wouldn't work because the high res table is the brighter orange, meaning that's the most recently selected object, and the low res table is the darker orange. We need that to be the other way around. So if you just sort of shift click it again, it'll toggle between the two. So our low res table is the active object that we were wanting to bake to, and the high res object is the other object selected, slightly darker orange. It's going to take the detail from that and put it onto our low res mesh. So under the render properties, again, make sure this is set to cycles. make sure your GPU is active if it's supported. This will totally work baking, using only the CPU. It'll just go slower, and in some cases drastically slower. Render, which again, the settings in this file are already set up and good to go. If this is something like 4000, that'll still work, but it'll take forever. If you change the settings in the viewport, it'll change what you're previewing here, but it won't change the bake settings. These are the ones you want. So 300, which again, 300 is probably overkill. You're sort of looking at anywhere between like 20 and 300. Depends on what you're trying to bake and how much detail you're trying to capture a bit, but 300 works fine for me. Particularly because we're only baking to very small textures for Dark Forces anyway, so it's not going to make that much of a difference. But if you are baking a 4K texture, the amount of samples you put in here is pretty linear to how long this process is going to take. If we scroll down, so again, if these settings are hidden, it'll be under sampling. If we scroll down further, we get the bake settings. So bake, and this is what we're going to want here. Just one quick word, there is color management in Blender. This defaults generally to Filmic or one of the others. For what we're doing here, you probably just want to put it to standard. The whole color management thing is a very long-winded explanation, which doesn't really apply that much to Dark Forces. But just select standard and things will behave more as you expect them to for this process. So by default, selected to active won't be turned on. We are going to turn that on because this is what makes the process work, where we take our high-res mesh, put the details on the low-res mesh, and then bring that low-res baked texture into Dark Forces. So selected to active is on. Extrusion by default will be set to 0. So this is where the model of the high-res is slightly different or poking through the model of the low-res. So if we set that to 0.1, the ray tracing will look outwards, 0.1 of a Dark Forces unit, or in this case 0.1 of a meter, to capture the outer edge of the detail. This is something that, like, 0.1 is not the set answer. This often needs a little bit of tinkering with to get exactly right. But 0.1 will work for us and what we need. So if I click bake, it's going to think about it. And we've got our texture over here. By default, this is set to adjacent faces, which if I click bake, it'll do its best guess to sort of figure out what faces are next to each other and then fill in the rest of that texture there. Whereas if we do extend, which is generally what you want, click bake, it'll take the outer edge of that pixel on the edge of where the polygon was and just extrude that in or extend it until it hits blank space. Again, within the engine of Dark Forces, that's not going to make a huge difference, but it's handy to know if you end up baking textures for other pieces of software. Basically, just, if you're a bit further away from the model and it doesn't know which pixel to put on which edge, because, lack of anti-aliasing and all that sort of thing, this just acts as a fail-safe to make sure you've got the right colors in the right spots at the edges between your polygons. So at this point, we can hide our high-res table, and this image is still black. That's because that has not been updated yet. So I'm just going to quickly save this file. If we go to this image here, it's table 02 and it's got the detail we want on it, but it's currently just sitting in memory. It's not actually an image file yet. So we need to do image, save as, table 02, go back to our material, open, select table 02, and there we go. We have our nice low-res baked texture. So at this point, if you've watched the first video, you can do File, Export, Dark Forces 3DO to export the model of the table itself, and Image, Save As, which we just did to make sure that's a PNG. The next step will be to open the texture converter, create BM, common colors only, that's okay. Add image, table02, open, and save. So now we have our new texture ready to use. This you will then bring into the project folder in the same way that we did in the first video, alongside the 3DO. And if the names have all been set up correctly and everything's called table02 across the line, Dark Forces will already know to look for that texture and put it onto your 3DO accordingly. If we go to our texture settings, this is something I've changed before, but by default, it'll be on linear interpolation. So this puts anti-aliasing, pretty much, all over the texture. And, you know, while in a modern scenario, that's probably what you would want to get textures looking more natural and realistic and whatever. Dark Forces doesn't really have that. So it's about pixel art in most cases. So if we put that to closest, it'll just show the raw pixels as they're going to show up in the engine. This can make it handy for previewing how it's actually going to look like before you even get into the editor itself. So while you can edit this image further in Photoshop or GIMP or any other image editing program of your choice, you can also directly paint onto the 3D model in Blender, which can be very useful because picturing where the details are going to go in 3D space, you know, can work quite nicely and be quite intuitive. But if you want to clean up certain details in 2D because that's what you're used to, you can do both, and it'll update live and in real time on both panels. So if we go from UV editor to image editor, make sure this is in paint mode, and then in our 3D view, make sure we were also in texture paint mode here. N key in either window will bring up you know, our texture painting options. We only really need it in one. We've got our color picker here, so if we were to add, you know, some nice blue tints. Now, for those who haven't done much with textures and converting into Dark Forces, there is a specific color palette that you will need to inherently adhere to. But for now, I know that there are blues in the color palette in general that are around here. And we can just write, hi, graffiti our own table. And the reason this isn't showing up here is because we are have the texture loaded into the GPU for memory for the rendering. But if we just go back to viewport shading instead of the full-blown you know, render preview, that'll work fine. And of course at this point everything is just coming through as a flat texture. We don't even need the lighting anyway, so we can just go ahead and hide all the lights and everything will still behave as we want it to. So now that is updating live across both objects. So if we were to paint in 3D space, and again this isn't behaving particularly nicely because the brush is at a different scale, so we'll hit the F key. That'll bring our brush up in size in this viewport. There we go. I am an artist. And that'll update live across both. So while graffiti tags might not be the most useful thing, again, you know, depending on what texture you're painting, it could be walls in a less than reputable part of the space station. But if we were to just add in a darker brown just to get a little bit more detail out of this surface, and again you can use a Wacom tablet if you have one. I am just using the mouse to prove that that still works. Just, you know, a bit of grime or wear and tear. This doesn't have to be set to a strength of 1. This will work, again, with the pressure sensitive tablet if you have one. If I change the strength of that down, it'll add, you know, depending on what percentage of strength you've got that. If you've not used a Wacom tablet, they make an amazing amount of difference. Also, Wacom's not the only brand, it's just what everyone's used to saying out loud. So, you know, if we wanted to paint in a bit of wood grain or, you know, a bit of grime and mold sort of growing down the side there, probably just set that to more of a black. And again, you'll get to know pretty quickly with the texture conversion tool what works and what doesn't into the palette for your level. or if we wanted to put that to full white, strength of 1, up the brush size a bit with the F key, and make sure that's actually on white. So here we can click the color itself, saturation slider down, and maybe just embed some fancy lights into the table. Yeah, so I mean, there are different brush types depending on what you sort of want to do. You can use different blend modes as you would for painting in Photoshop. So you've got your multiply, your overlay, screen, all that sort of stuff. And then from here, remembering that these changes have only been made to the image in memory, you would then go Image, Save As, make sure you have saved your image, then convert it into a BM, bring it into your Dark Forces project folder in the correct format, and then, yeah, again, if you haven't changed the name of the texture, just what's in it, Dark Forces should load that in correctly, and yeah, make sure your changes are shown in Engine. That wraps up the second video for working with Blender and 3DOs for creating assets for Dark Forces. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, be sure to visit in the Discord, and I'll see what I can do to help. There is also a wiki page on the DF21 site, which if I add any other videos to this series, that's where you'll sort of find the most immediate link and information or any extra tutorial files around it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.